Welcome to this webinar. My name is Dr. Stan Karanasios from RMIT University, and along with my colleagues, Professor Vanessa Cooper, Associate Professor Marta Poblet-Balcell, we will be presenting the findings of our research which focused on vulnerable populations and emergencies, and the role that social media plays. The webinar is a resource for practitioners and researchers in this space to better understand how social media is used to engage different at-risk and vulnerable groups, the challenges that are presented in this space, as well as a means for us to translate our research to a broader audience. The webinar is structured into several parts. I will give an overview of the research and its motivation. Then each of us will take turns in presenting a phase of the research. And in doing so, we will focus on recommendations for practitioners and researchers in this space. And then finally, the webinar will conclude with some overview of the key themes from this research. For practitioners, the webinar is intended to act as a conversation starter or a guide to help you think about how social media is used to engage and reach out to different vulnerable groups during emergencies. There are several key outputs from this research. And I'll come back to that later on, but the key outputs involve a report, a short guide for practitioners, academic publications, and a video of a workshop and industry panel which was conducted in November 2018. And I'll come back to these points later on, whereby I showcase where these outputs are presented on our website. In terms of background, the research was motivated by several key themes. First of all, there are several studies that examine organizations in the emergency and disaster space, and they typically focus on the horizontal level. So that is police, fire, ambulance, and other government agencies. These studies tend to neglect the broader landscape of actors involved in the information ecosystem in emergencies and organizations that play a very important role, such as NGOs, local government, private organizations, community-based organizations, and increasingly volunteer and informal groups. Traditionally, the research tends to focus on established organizations, like I've said, but this research focuses on expanding organizations, so firms or organizations that grow when there is an emergency in terms of capacity, extending organizations such as supermarkets or other retailers that provide resources, as well as emerging groups, which are growing in their importance through social media and other digital platforms. The research clearly tells us that technology and digital technology and social media in particular is playing an important role when it comes to information provision during emergencies. Also importantly, that studies usually consider individuals and communities as homogeneous. And this research is different because it is the first research of its kind to look at vulnerable people and different at-risk groups. And this is important because there is a great understanding that at-risk groups suffer disproportionately during disasters. For example, during the Australian bushfires, Japan earthquake, hurricanes in the USA, etc., report after report tells us that vulnerable people, such as the elderly, disabled, socially and geographically isolated, individuals with economic limitations, suffer the most. And for this research, we have purposely adopted a broad framing of vulnerable. Rather than limited to one particular group, we understand that it can be temporal, and it is something that is broad in definition. Also, the literature tells us that there are shifting information patterns. So now 2/3 of adults rely on social media for news. And we're entering a stage now whereby we are living in the age of hyper-personalization in terms of everything that we do, the products and services we consume. And therefore, when it comes to information, we also expect this level of personalization. And in terms of context, in Victoria and Australia, we're facing a challenge now in terms of the command and control approach to information provision, or the notion of one source, one message, whereby information is filtered from the top down, because now we expect information to come from the bottom up as well. And this research looks at this tension and how it can be addressed. Importantly for us, this research builds on current discourse in this space in Victoria and other parts of the world, where there are recent publications and reports and workshops that are focused on reviewing vulnerable people in emergencies and ways to better meet their needs. However, this is the first research project of its kind to focus on vulnerable groups and social media in particular. The study is organized in 3 main phases. Phase 1 focuses on the organizational level. This includes organizations such as central organizing agencies, the blue light services, police, fire, ambulance, local governments, NGOs, community-based organizations, informal groups, and private firms. In our study, we wanted to focus in particular, in the case of private firms, on platform-based actors, because we see these groups, or these all types of organizations, as playing an important role and an emergent role in this space. Phase 2 focused on an analysis of social media data. We analyzed around 8,000 organizational social media posts to examine how they tailor the information to different vulnerable groups. In phase 3, we look at the individual level. We examine the perspective of 47 individuals in focus groups and interviews, and 215 individuals in completed surveys. At the organizational level, here I summarize the key actors that were involved in the research: government agencies, emergency response organizations, local governments, NGOs, community-based organizations, informal and community groups, and non-traditional actors. Again, in our case, this refers to platform-based actors. In total, we examined 28 organizations in 1 state of Australia, and we conducted 43 interviews across those organizations. This figure represents the way that these organizations use information and social media in the context of emergencies. At one end of the spectrum, you have government organizations and emergency response organizations who provide information that is largely top-down and disseminated in a, let's say, broadcast way. At the other end of the spectrum, we have informal community groups and community-based organizations which rely largely on their networks, largely on peer-based information, and often relay official advice, but also use their platforms such as social media and Facebook as a forum for sharing information, for networking, and for local intelligence. At that end of the spectrum, we found that organizations, the informal groups, community-based organizations, and NGOs typically rely on Facebook, whereas local governments, government organizations, and emergency response organizations tend to have a more diverse toolkit of social media applications, ranging from Twitter, even Weibo, as well as the ones we would expect, such as Facebook and so on. They use these platforms to provide guidance and information to the community, as well as to gather intelligence. And in the next part of the presentation, my colleague will talk about the way they provide information to the community. This slide attempts to map out the different pathways of information between all those organizations, government agencies and emergency response organizations, local governments, NGOs and community group organizations, and platform-based actors. The thicker lines are intended to represent greater flows of information, whereas the thinner lines are meant to represent more narrow volumes of information. The dotted lines represent where more social media or digital technology information provision takes place. Finally, the blue squiggly line, which you can see to the right, is where the role of information brokers comes in. And these are people that will take information presented by those range of organizations and relay it to community members and different vulnerable groups through a range of different means, including social media, but also face-to-face and other forms of communication. One of the interesting parts of this research is the different views when it comes to vulnerability that exist. And I won't read through all these quotes here, but these are taken from a range of organizations that participated. And what they really show is that Vulnerability is something that is considered to be nuanced, difficult, problematic to define, and again, full of tension. And this is welcoming in some ways because it shows that organizations understand that vulnerability is dynamic, it can be temporal rather than a fixed state. But also that it shows that they understand that it is an issue that needs to be addressed in terms of information provision in some way. For government agencies, emergency response organizations, local governments, there were three dominant strategies when it came to social media. The first one was non-specific information. And this is the case of social media being used to broadcast information that, let's say, is vanilla flavored. It is generic to the entire population. And you can see a quote there to that effect. The second strategy is to provide some targeted information. And this may be the case whereby there may be a telephone link or a community hotline link. There may be a link to a translation service, but not particularly tailored information to a specific group. The third strategy is to engage what we call intermediaries or information brokers. And this is where social media is used by organizations to target people that can relay that information. So for example, it can be middle-aged women because they are typically more likely to look after young children as well as their elderly parents who are both vulnerable in heat. And this is a way of, let's say, getting your information echoed and disseminated to the people that need it most. Amongst non-government organizations, community-based organizations, informal groups, and different firms, again, we see three different strategies. We see social media being used for contextualizing and sense-making, whereby, for instance, an initial message, say broadcast by an emergency response organization, is used as a starting point for a conversation within the community. For example, this may be on Facebook, whereby someone posts that warning, but then that warning becomes the stimulus for people to contribute, to sense make, to provide images and so on around that, and really to develop a localized picture of that contingency. In terms of community resilience, social media is used in a general way to post messages like, look out for vulnerable, e.g. older persons in the community, as well as educating people or people in the community about those that may be more disadvantaged. The third strategy is really about reaffirming top-down messages, and we see this happening quite often, whereby social media is only used to relay those messages that are coming from those official channels. And some organizations are quite adamant that they do not want to provide tailored information. Some will say to their constituents and the communities, don't come to us for information, we're not going to give it to you. Others are quite aware that the information that they provide is not dynamic, it's not moving, and are looking at ways to adapt this. And some private firms are adamant again that they will not provide tailored information. They will rather provide links to official sources of information. So what are the key findings from this phase of the research? We see in some ways, and you'll see this across the other phases of the research as well, some tension between the logic of top-down, command and control, or the one source, one message paradigm, and the need for customized and local context-specific information. In some ways, we see digital technology and the new actors emerging in this space in the way they are using platforms to provide a challenge to the traditional way of information provision. Some of these platform-based actors are better positioned to provide information than the traditional actors in this space. What we also note is that along with the emergence of new actors, for example, the platform-based actors, the greater role that community groups are playing and informal groups are playing, is that we see a messiness and a more complex range of actors in the space, which can increase the complexity of the translation processes of information, which allows for divergent interpretations to evolve and take place, and may result in outcomes and behavior that is difficult to predict. The top-down actors are again aware that they are limited in how they can provide tailored information, but they're quite happy also to relegate some of this tailoring and sense-making to the intermediaries and to other organizations who are better positioned to localize, tailor information, and so on. In terms of recommendations for organizations, from the formal organizations to the very informal, here are some points that may be of assistance. Social media can be used to listen, to understand what your community concerns are and the questions they are asking. For talking, so for reaching out to them, providing warning information, starting that conversation, and for supporting and engaging as well. So helping people to address their concerns, providing links, and a place for them to share information. While we see in this project that the informal organizations particularly rely on Facebook, what we see in the broader literature is trends towards shifting patterns in social media use. So it is necessary to consider what your communities are using beyond Facebook. For organizations, this study shows that it is important not only to consider how you will target information, but to consider the role of information brokers who play a critical role in passing on critical information. In our project too, we take the view that different at-risk groups are not simply vulnerable groups. They are also experienced, knowledgeable persons who can provide some knowledge and have tacit knowledge in this space. And they should be tapped into as well. And social media is a great platform for eliciting and capturing their knowledge and relying on their knowledge in emergencies. A concern that needs to be considered is that social media also allows individuals to adapt, change the message, spread disinformation, and so on, meaning that for formal organizations and for informal organizations, they can lose control of the conversation. So measures need to be put in place to consider how you control the conversation. Along these lines, what we saw in our study is a range of different resources available, or resource capabilities across a range of organizations, with some organizations having formal teams, others relying on digital volunteers, and others doing things on the fly. So understanding your resource limitations is critical to understanding what you can achieve through social media. A final point here is that often individuals do not consider themselves to be at risk or vulnerable, and therefore it is necessary to consider that when providing targeted information, the people that may need it the most may also ignore these messages because they do not see themselves as fitting within that vulnerable group. Finally, this is a takeaway for organizations in terms of how they can use social media. One is for broadcasting, so posting emergency-related information, advice and warnings, and this can be the top-down approach. This can rely on relaying that formal information. Second is crowdsourcing, so tapping into local knowledge and experience, but also using those broadcast messages as a conversation starter for crowdsourcing around that message to develop that localized and tailored image of what is happening. And the third is a critical point that is typically ignored in the literature, and that is finding information brokers. And these are trusted intermediaries for vulnerable persons and ensuring that your message at least reaches these people who can then use their other means to relay it on to other persons. At this point, I'll pass you over to my colleague Marta, who will discuss our analysis of social media data.
Thanks, Stan. I'm going to focus on the social media analysis that we did within the framework of this project. To give a bit of a background, in recent years, there's been an explosion of organizations across the world, digital organizations, working in topics related with social media and disaster management. It can be monitoring social media, it can be mapping, using crowdsourcing to map emergencies, it can be using data, it can be translating, it can be creating data sets. So all these organizations, which now are fully incorporated, most of them, started as digital volunteer groups, working together in a real time, 24/7, across the world to help more formal organizations in making sense of social media data. At the same time, a number of platforms and tools and digital tools were developed by those teams and other people to help those digital volunteers to aggregate, filter, and publish that information. So now we have a growing ecosystem of tools, digital platforms that help organizations across the world to make sense of information in social media with some interesting results and outcomes. For instance, just to show an example, years ago when Hurricane Sandy struck Manhattan, this tool allowed digital volunteers to geofence a particular area in Manhattan and retrieve all social media information from different sources, public sources, tweets, public Instagram accounts, Facebook accounts, people who were tweeting, posting, updating their status with information related to disaster management. In that case, the tool would help to retrieve those particular social media contents that were relevant for the disaster emergency. Other tools can facilitate the filtering of social media when it comes to emergencies such as earthquakes. And in that example, what we see is a request from crowdcrafting to volunteers to consider whether the tweets posted in the aftermath of an earthquake were not relevant, or whether it refers to some needs, infrastructural damage, or etc., or simply not relevant. So volunteers could help to categorize those tweets and, for example, map them on a crowdsourced map such as this one, which was used in the aftermath of the tsunami in Japan. So what you can see here is a number of red dots that if we would focus, zoom in, we would see different reports structured by categories of events. So that's social media for emergency management. The caveat, the problem is that not everyone is connected to social media. Not everyone has a social media account. And as we've seen before, in many emergencies, the most vulnerable are populations that are not necessarily connected to social media. Again, when a disaster strikes, the most vulnerable people are the disproportionately affected. That's what happened not just in Hurricane Sandy, but also in the Japanese tsunami. And as my colleague mentioned, over and over, this a repeated pattern. And a pattern that is going to be even more acute in the years to come if we consider global population trends. So as the population will be aging more and more vulnerable people among these populations will disproportionately suffer the consequences of emergencies and disasters. There's a growing body of literature that confirms this for several groups of population. So what we did in our particular study was to make an analysis of whether our social media contents published by both formal organizations and informal organizations were targeting to general population, or rather they were considering specific groups. So for that, we considered phase 2 in this study to be the qualitative analysis of social media data. We collected up to nearly 305,000 tweets that use different hashtags that are now very common. Whenever in Victoria we have fires, floods, storms, it's quite now normal that people will and organizations will tweet using those hashtags. So we collected all these tweets, and our results show clearly that tweets mentioning vulnerable groups were almost absent. So from a total of 3,500, we could only collect 3 tweets mentioning vulnerable groups from both formal and informal organizations. And that's one of the few examples. So addressing elderly people. That confirms what my colleague Stan said in the first part of the webinar, in that formal and informal organizations are rather not targeting vulnerable groups, but disseminating more general information that then can be used by information brokers to target these particular groups. With Facebook, it's exactly the same pattern. Even though we collected more, up to 8,000 posts from both formal and informal organizations, posting social media information on emergencies on Facebook, the pattern is exactly the same. Is publishing more general information rather than tailored information. And when it comes to tailored information, the only groups that we could see that had been especially addressed were groups that would suffer asthma in some specific storm conditions. But apart from that, there were very general warnings. The specific warnings, a few examples of them are posted here when it comes to heat or fire events. An interesting finding that might be relevant for organizations here is that the social media contents which receive more engagement in terms of comment counting were the ones that used images, notably photos, but also videos. So that's maybe a takeaway that can be considered for organizations, and that images will probably attract more comments and engagement. Lessons learned or conclusions. The tensions between the top-down model emphasizing clear and consistent information, a contrast with the demands for information that is contextualized to individual needs. So organizations feel the challenge to strike a correct balance between consistent and clear information, at the same time that being specific enough to target some people. So the issues are not clearly easy to solve, and it's not just how social media is used, but also that some community groups have limited capabilities and capacities to develop or maintain an effective social media presence. So that also has to be taken into account. The key areas for further research would be how to make information when it comes to vulnerable populations more contextual and granular. How to specify the role of information brokers in the context of social media analysis. We think that social network analysis would be very useful for both researchers and organizations when it comes to make a better profile of who the information broker is and what are the information needs that he needs to convey. And finally, it's interesting to think of the regulatory models surrounding social media information in that space, because it will be linked with questions not just of safety, but also with questions to privacy and liabilities. And now I'm going to pass to my colleague, Vanessa Cooper, to develop the third part of the webinar.
Our survey design was informed by interviews and focus groups capturing the views of 47 users and non-users of social media. The key themes that emerged from the interviews and focus groups emphasise the importance of informal community networks and relationships in first, helping people make sense of emergencies, and second, in developing more specific information on what was going on locally. We found that women tend to be greater users of social media than men, and that some older individuals had no interest in becoming users of social media. The qualitative methods highlighted that non-users of social media rely on those who do use social media to pass on up-to-date information to them. We saw also that knowledge of how emergency services organisations use social media is low, as is knowledge of tools such as the Vic Emergency app. For our survey, we adapted the instrument by Reiter and Spielhofer, which was originally designed to study social media use by European citizens. Our survey was administered online and had 34 questions employing quantitative and qualitative methods. These questions focused on eliciting demographic information, as well as attitudes towards seeking information, receiving information indirectly, and sharing information by social media during extreme weather events. Our respondents comprised 215 Victorian social media users who identify as being over 60 years old, geographically or socially isolated, suffering from physical limitations and/or being of low socioeconomic means. Most of our respondents identified as belonging to one vulnerable group, but just over 1/5 identified with multiple groups. We had slightly more women than men complete the survey. Our respondents were from diverse age groups, but 53% were aged between 21 and 39. Respondents were also from diverse national backgrounds, but with 75% being from an English-speaking background. Respondents lived in diverse household types, and just over 1/3 of respondents reported to have children under the age of 18. We looked into technology and social media use in general and found that the technology reported to be used most often was the smartphone. Facebook was the most frequently used social media application, with 70% of respondents using this often. In contrast, many respondents reported that they never used Twitter, blogs, chat tools, or Instagram. We looked into social media use in emergencies when compared to a typical day and found that 55% of respondents use social media more often during emergencies, 38% use social media less often during emergencies, and 7% use it about the same amount of time under both conditions. Interestingly, we saw that social media use is the second most common channel used behind TV to seek information about an extreme weather event, whereas less than half of our respondents used mobile apps, as well as few being very aware of Facebook safety checks or Twitter alerts. 87% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that emergency services organisations should use social media to stay in touch with the public during emergencies. Trust emerges as an important issue. Our results indicated that individuals lack trust in social media posts unless they come from an official source, and almost 1/3 of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that emergency services organisations should not trust information on social media. Information on weather conditions or warnings was the most commonly sought information, with eyewitness photos being the least commonly sought type of information. Just under half of our respondents sought information on what to do to keep themselves safe. In terms of future social media use, 88% of our respondents indicated it was very likely or quite likely that they would use social media in the future to seek information about an extreme weather event. Information provided on social media by emergency services organisations and government agencies was considered helpful by 93% and 88% of respondents respectively. Information provided by community groups and non-government organisations was considered not applicable to 18% and 12% of our respondents respectively. We looked into the receipt of information indirectly via social media. For example, situations where vulnerable people are passed on information from social media by family or friends. 66% of our respondents had received information via social media indirectly, with 22% being unsure if they had received information via social media indirectly. We saw similar patterns between information received directly and indirectly. As you can see in the diagram, the order of the types of information received is the same, other than the last two entries where the order is reversed. 70% of our respondents reported that they were very likely or quite likely to act on information provided to them from social media indirectly, with only 3% not at all likely to act on such information. The qualitative results indicated that to act on information from social media whether received indirectly or directly. What was important was the level of trust in the source. Almost 2/3 of our respondents have used social media to share information as a result of an emergency. Eyewitness descriptions, photos and videos were amongst the least common type of information shared, along with advice to others. More women than men had shared information on social media about an extreme weather event. And 73% of respondents reported that they were either very likely or quite likely to use social media to share information regarding an emergency in the future. Only 5% of respondents reported that they were not at all likely to share information regarding an emergency on social media. 75% of respondents agreed that emergency services organisations should regularly monitor their social media sites. 62% thought that emergency services organisations were too busy, however, during an extreme weather event to do so. 53% of respondents would expect a response to their post within an hour, but 61% believed that emergency services organisations would not know about such a request. Our results indicate that there are opportunities for sharing good practice across the sector. This might include standard setting, developing strategies to address issues such as the use of social media for vulnerable sections of the community, providing good practice guidelines and setting up a community of practice for the sector. There are also important education opportunities. It would be valuable to train community-based social media operators to help ensure that communication of informal networks is managed. And there are opportunities to raise the public's awareness of how emergency services organisations monitor and use social media. Thank you.
Having reviewed those 3 phases of research, now I will recap on the main findings and key themes of our research, and which provide some directions for future conversations and for future research as well. One of the main areas we unpacked in terms of findings is information challenges. And as I pointed to earlier, and as has been pointed to in other parts of presentations from my colleagues, we see a tension in the top-down information flows. And we see this as a challenge to the command and control, or one source and one message paradigm. And we can see this because almost 50% of survey respondents surveyed prefer to use community groups and social media, community group social media. And that's our social media analysis show that tailored social media content is minimal. So what we see is difference in practice in terms of what individuals and vulnerable groups are doing, and the difference between what is being provided by government organisations. The second point is about overcoming bias against vulnerability. So that there is a need to balance consistent, clear information and targeted contextualised information while accounting for bias against alignment with vulnerability. So this is the point that people do not always align themselves as being vulnerable. And this is where we see the use and reliance on information brokers as critical. The third point is around overlapping actors. And as I've pointed to, there is a convergence in this space between a range of different actors, such as organic community groups and how they use social media, and platform-based actors as well. And some of these platform-based actors, as I've noted, are very well positioned to reach out to their constituents, to their customers, and provide information services in a much more expedient manner than traditional organizations. The fourth point here is about misinformation, disinformation, and noise. A real challenge for the range of organizations, and a real challenge for individuals as well, is making sense of the plethora of information that exists. Disinformation and noise can really hamper effective communication strategies by responding in government organizations. We see this as being an issue also around information overload and warning fatigue as well. The second main theme is around technology practices and capabilities. Firms need to consider how they will build internal capability. And we see this in terms of our study as a real unevenness in resources. Now, this is a challenge going forward because 88% of individuals expect to use social media more for future emergency information, and expectations are likely to grow, with 75% of individuals agreeing that emergency response organizations should regularly monitor their social media sites. And 52% would be expecting a response within an hour. So to meet these demands, formal organizations need to really gear up their resources and their internal capabilities. And informal organizations also need to consider how they will be able to resource and monitor their platforms. The second point here is about changing patterns of social media use. We see that individuals, and in our study vulnerable people, are using social media more and more to rely on in terms of information about emergencies. And it was only second to TV in terms of an information resource, more than the radio. But there's also, I think, a need to unpack the way that different social media platforms are used. And as I noted earlier, there are shifting patterns in terms of people moving away from what we consider to be the big social media platforms, such as Facebook, to other emerging platforms. The third point here is about complementing and not substituting. And this study is focused clearly on social media, but there is a need to understand how social media complements traditional information and communication channels rather than substitutes them. The fourth point here is about evaluating the effectiveness of communication and information programs. So no matter what strategy your firm is or organization is undertaking in terms of how you provide information, whether it is a broadcast approach, relying on information intermediaries, or simply relaying top-down information messages, there's a need to understand how effective your information strategy is. Are users engaging with this information? Can you track how many times it's shared or liked? Can you track where it is shared? And so on. The third and final theme is about engaging at-risk groups and vulnerability. As we mentioned, the term vulnerability is contested amongst a range of different actors. And there's a need to better understand the temporal and contextual elements of vulnerability, and this will be helpful to better provide information to these at-risk groups. The second point here is about privacy and intrusion concerns. There's a need to manage the tension of understanding individuals' vulnerability whilst respecting privacy. And this is a serious concern given that social media magnifies information and can really disturb people's privacy as well. The third point here is about identification and visibility of vulnerable persons. Managing the challenge of effectively identifying vulnerable persons in light of the multifaceted and fluid nature of vulnerability is a real concern. So how do you go about identifying who is vulnerable in your community? What we see in our study is that 62% of vulnerable people use social media to share information. So we see this as a critical group to tap into in order to understand how they share information, how they can help spread information as well. Thank you for your time. Also some acknowledgements. This study is funded by the Emergency Management National Disaster Resilience Grant Scheme. And we also would like to acknowledge some key individuals who provided input into our research as well. If you'd like further access to our resources, including a report from this research, academic publications from this research, an information guide for different organizations, as well as to keep up to date with our other outputs and our dissemination activities, please visit us at cpow.org.au and visit the current projects tab under projects. We hope you have found this webinar to be useful. If you'd like to get in contact with us, please reach out to us via cpow.org.au or contact myself, Stan Karanasios, on stan.karanasios@rmit.edu.au. And the next slide provides some contact information where you can reach out to us. We are also welcome to your feedback as well and further ideas for research.